So for those of you that know me, I have probably mentioned Linear once, twice, maybe 5 dozen times. It is a product that I've been obsessed with for several years. One, and for two reasons, really. The first one being the business is fairly interesting. I think they took a strategy that is pretty counter to what most of the advice that you hear today is. And it's influenced pretty much everything I do. And then two, I believe that it's actually probably the best web app that I have ever seen by a far margin, particularly because they use a fairly unique architecture that is not really well known and is quite different from where like the status quo and what generally web developers think about. And so with that teaser, I'd like to welcome Tuomas Artman, co-founder and CTO of Linear. How are you doing today?
Doing good. Thanks so much for having me.
For those of you that don't know, Linear is a project management tool. And this is not a unique idea. Every developer in the world has probably at some point hated their project management tool, has had an idea to start a new one. There are dozens, if not, it might be 100. I don't know what the market size is. Not a unique idea at all. So it feels weird to start a company saying, I am going to build yet another project management tool. And it's shocking to see that that actually was quite successful. So I'd love to hear about the original, kind of at the beginning, like when you chose to found the company, what was the mindset? How are you guys thinking about it?
It was actually, pretty interesting. It took us a while to sort of, get behind the idea of doing project management or software for project management. Because ultimately, like in the beginning, we thought it was a pretty boring space to be in. Like, the founders, we all came from sort of, consumer companies. I was working at Uber back in the day. Jory was at Coinbase and Kari was at Airbnb. And we started talking probably like, 6 years ago now with Jory about sort of the state of issue tracking and project management at all of these companies. I think Uber was using Fabricator for sort of engineering. They were moving, essentially, over to Jira just after I left. Coinbase was using, I think, GitHub Issues, but moved over to Jira as well pretty quickly. And Airbnb was on Jira, from the get-go. And sort of I think it was me and Jory who started talking about sort of like the sense that we have gotten from the state of project management at these product companies, and we sort of felt that ICs really didn't enjoy and didn't like what they were using, and that it was usually mandated by sort of project for product management or project managers or middle management, and then sort of engineers and your ICs just had used whatever tool the middle management came up with. And we continued hearing, from all these different companies that we just, randomly chatted with, that ICs really were underserviced by the issue tracking needs or by the needs of their project management. Like to ICs, project management is very different than for your product managers or managers per se, because like you're just working off of a list of things that you need to do. So your visibility and your sort of interaction with the tool is much more constrained than when you're planning out what you want to build at a large company. And it seemed to us that none of the existing tools were really servicing the market of ICs. And for the longest time, we were just like, sort of wondering about why nobody has tackled the market, from the side of the IC, like why nobody has come up with a tool for ICs and tool that ICs would be happy to use. And it seemed like sort of a great market opportunity and great opportunity to build something you would immediately have quite a few customers in the smaller segment. Like if you started targeting smaller startups or companies with less than 50 employees, you would sort of be able to quite quickly come up with a product that would be useful for them. And it took us a while to actually jump on this because, as I said, like we found the idea of working on project management for the next years, quite boring. And the space itself wasn't really enticing to us. And even more when we talk with Kari, like Kari was even more sort of not very interested in the space, being a designer. himself. And I don't know what led to the realization, but we at some point understood that it's not really about project management or issue tracking or any of that. There's an underlying mission behind sort of what we actually wanted to achieve, which was helping product companies be better at building and shipping product. And that, felt like something that, we could sink our teeth into and that we felt was much more interesting and was a mission that we could get behind and work on for the next, 10 or so years. And with that realization, we started sort of, to sink our teeth into issue tracking at first. Because again, like that's the way to get to the market is to build an issue tracker. Because, you immediately had all the smaller startups that would enjoy using the product and where the product could be useful. And once you started working with the startups, those people are usually very vocal, and you can sort of easily chat with them and sort of understand, get an understanding what they need. And startups hopefully grow as time passes. So as they grow, so does our functionality and features that need to grow as well. So from the start, I think we call ourselves an issue tracker for the first 2 years of our existence. But we always knew that we wanted to do something different, something more than project management, issue tracking, and even something more than project management. We wanted to change how companies build product, and in a sense that was sort of a selfish mission as well, because we're users of software, and we sort of have these pivotal moments in our lives when we've used new hardware or new software that has literally changed our lives. Like the first time we saw iOS, for example, and used iOS ourselves, felt super magical. Not so much in the recent 10 years. We don't think much has happened. I don't know why, but maybe it is because people have become less good at building products or trying to do new things. And we just thought that if you can build an issue tracker that feels magical and feels like an application that people would look up to, then there's really no reason for anybody else to sort of do something less good. If your issue tracker is something that you enjoy using and that you look up to as a piece of software, then hopefully that is a motivation for you as well to build better software.
Yeah, and I can't understate how true that ended up being. Like I said, we started prior to using Linear for everything. The initial point you made about the lack of focus on ICs is a really good one. I tried a bunch of tools, and we actually settled on just using Airtable because we couldn't really find a tool that, as an IC, typically what you want to see is you wake up, you see the list of tasks for you in a very clear way, and you can knock them out. And then as someone that's in a different role, you need to see across and plan across people. And you're right, very few tools really just thought about it in that simple way. And we just ended up using Airtable because we were able to create the views that we needed for the project managers and the views that we needed for the day-to-day. So finding Linear was excellent because it kind of served exactly those two purposes. And once we started using it, I was like, this tool is so good. Why have I never cared about all these little details that they got right? And my software just kind of became better. It's kind of thing, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now that I know that it exists, am I really going to not shoot for something of that quality? I don't know why it hasn't been as common, but it might be as simple as just people just weren't thinking about it, and now that they're thinking about it, it's kind of like a breakthrough. So yeah, I think that intention has definitely been successful.
Yeah, I don't know. It's easy to sort of not know or not care about the user experience. When you're looking for product market fit, you don't want to sort of spend your time polishing the product when you don't know if you're going to succeed or not. And maybe that then becomes sort of the norm where because you never have cared too much about the spit and polish of your product, you just don't remember to do it once you actually have a following and once you have users.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was referring to at the beginning. The level of detail and polish that Linear has is quite opposite to most of the advice that you get, right? Don't waste time on that stuff when you don't even know if your business is going to be successful. But what's different about Linear is that is the differentiator, right? Of course, there's a lot more than just that. There's a lot of thought into the product, but a key differentiator and key advantage and key edge that you have is the fact that it's very good. And I think prior to me seeing Linear, I never realized that that could just be the thing that you differentiate on. Did you guys realize that very early on? Like, was that intentional, like the initial pitch, like when you were pitching investors, et cetera? And did people understand that?
That was literally the reason why we started Linear. Like, just like the market existed. Like, we weren't inventing anything new. Like, Jira had been around for 20 years at that point already, and there were like hundreds of different project management tools. And our idea from the get-go was just to be better, like better to the user, better as a user experience, better in all kinds of things. And we care deeply about the product. Like the founders, like we've always sort of have been interested in design and good UX. And all of that, and part of our careers have been built on that as well. So it was sort of easy to get started with that. And like I do remember, like when we started, like we started prototyping just on the weekends on what would an issue tracker look like. And we still have the history of like the first ticket that or the first issue that we put into Linear. It was sort of built the command menu. Which is kind of silly thing to do if you don't have a product. Like start with building out a command menu. But we were keen on figuring out whether we can build something on the web that felt more like an application. And obviously Superhuman was out back then. That was a big inspiration for us to look at their command menu, keyboard shortcuts, and try to build something that felt like a true native application on the web. And yeah, like from the get-go, we knew that we weren't building anything new, but the way for us to win the market would be to just be better. So hence sort of the focus on quality and UX.
So I don't know when you started raising money, but in the early process of pitching and explaining that, did investors understand that concept, or did it seem like were you able to show something to prove that, or they kind of have to go on your word?
I mean, we had an easy time raising money. Like I keep on saying that the experience of building Linear has been a very easy and different one. Like usually a startup comes with ups and downs. We've been just sort of coasting upwards. Like there have been no sort of bigger problems or challenges to begin with, which is super strange. Like I think we got just hugely lucky. So yeah, like our fundraising for a seed round was literally just a few weeks, and it was not of our own accord. Like we initially didn't want to raise money. Like we wanted to build essentially a prototype, just bootstrap it, get a few customers in, and have a product that sort of exemplified on what we want to build, and then if need be, go ahead and raise money. But as it turned out, Sequoia sort of was scouring through LinkedIn and sort of found out that one guy from Uber and one from Airbnb and one from Coinbase have founded a company, and they've put out a blog post, and Twitter is a bit of buzz about what they're building. So they reached out to us, and then sort of was rather quick at sort of getting the seed in. So we didn't really have to explain too much or show the product, because we back then we didn't have anything to show for. Like we did have a few prototypes, we did have a few designs, and I'm sure Kari put them on the deck. But it was very early. But I think they believed in the same mission of first targeting ICs, building it upwards from there, and just building a product that people enjoy using.
Cool. So switching gears to something else that you said. So a key part of building something like Linear is it's not just a product. You also need to think about what your opinion on the right way to build products is, and you kind of bake some of that philosophy into the product itself. And I think Linear also has I forgot what you guys call it. You have an actual document. Like the linear approach, or what is it? Remember what it's called?
Yeah, we have the linear method.
Linear method, exactly. Was that something you discovered as you built the product, or up front did you guys kind of all find alignment on that?
The method itself was something, and it's still in flux. Like we haven't completed the method yet. It's something that we someday want to finish up and get closure on. But in the beginning, we did have this idea of we don't want to build just a product. Like we want to have some sort of mission statement or idea or methodology behind it. And that same came from the insight that we had when we were working at these larger companies that people looked up to when they were building products. And we sort of all realized that, none of the internal teams really knew how to build product or what the methodology was. Like everybody, depending on team, you usually use something akin to Scrum. And when you ask people like, why are you using Scrum or why you're sprinting, people wouldn't really know what the answer was. And they were like, I don't know, everybody does it like this. So I guess, it's iterative development, so it makes sense. And I always found it strange that, Scrum has been invented for a very different world. Like Scrum initially was made when you had sort of a non-technical customer and a technical team. And the non-technical customer wanted working software from that technical team. And the technical team didn't want the customer to sort of get involved when they were actually working on stuff. And so you came up with this framework that worked for both companies, for the customer and the technical team. And every 4 weeks or so, the customer would get something out of it. And for the rest of the time, the customer would sort of give the team space to implement whatever was asked for. And that's not how product companies work nowadays anymore. Like there sort of needs to be a different way of building product that makes much more sense for the current world, where like you have integrated teams within the company building their own software.
Yeah, and especially at smaller companies, this thing where it's a good point about the customer not being super involved, like kind of giving space, and that's what it was designed for. This is exactly the issue I had with a lot of the approach earlier in my career at companies that were building software. You would plan out something like some kind of like longer term thing. We're going to do exactly X, Y, and Z things. And then 3 days later, you would have an interaction with the customer, and you would get suddenly really excited to solve some problem that wasn't on your roadmap. Because when you're not talking about your customers, all issues kind of seem equal. But the moment like someone has a problem, suddenly an issue is like the top of your mind. So yeah, having that flexibility, I think the reality is, and I've only ever worked at really early stage companies, it's very hard to know what you're going to be excited about week to week. So a lot of these tools are about like locking in these long-term plans. And I found that almost never really worked out.
I totally agree. Like it's almost like, building it waterfally, which was what, Scrum
wasn't supposed to not do
in the beginning, but was trying to avoid.
Yeah. It's been my experience as well. Everyone is doing Agile, but if you actually look at what they're doing, it's like, it's entirely a waterfall process. So I think that's really awesome, where there's like a whole document teaching you how to build product. So it's the three of you came from, at least the last, I'm sure you've had other experience before, but the last job you were at prior to founding this was at bigger companies. So when you're kind of developing this method, did you feel like there's a trade-off with what works at smaller companies, what works at bigger companies, or do you generally find that there actually is a good approach that works pretty well for everyone?
I mean, no approach works the same for everybody. And I think like people, when they sort of look at the linear method and what we've described there, it is sort of common sense stuff. Like it is not very descriptive, for the plain reason that you have to take it and sort of make it your own, because no company is alike. But the idea was that there's nothing inherently in building a product that would be different at a large company and a small company. Like I think the method and the way of working still works regardless of size. Because rather than sort of getting teams of hundreds of engineers, like companies tend to break up in teams into smaller pieces and work on functionality individually. So if you have a small company, you just have less stuff that you're working on at the moment. If you have a larger company, you've got sort of more initiatives, but the initiatives themselves sort of work in the same way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I think a lot of times when companies see how a smaller company operates, they might think that could never work for us because we're big, or they'll have some reason. But I think I found that, yes, it's not exactly the same, but roughly the principles are the same. It's usually the low-level principles that you need to get right. And when things are broken, it's usually because they're not following some of those ideas. That's a lot on like Linear as the business, the product. But my audience is mostly engineers. I'm trying to get them thinking more about those things. That's why I love to talk about stuff in that category. But let's kind of get into some of the technical details, right? With Linear, when you're using the product, every interaction you do is near instant. Or it's literally instant. You probably can't tell. So whether that's something simple like marking an issue as done, or something more complicated like searching through all your open issues, every keystroke, instant response. And I remember initially the landing page, or at some point the landing page like very clearly said that, or maybe it continues to say that. When was that like the perspective? When did you guys decide that was the perspective you wanted? That was like a rule, like you needed to have instant reaction times to everything.
Again, from the get-go, like before we even started working on anything, the way we started prototyping an issue tracker, or the first sort of prototype of Linear, was like I had spent, I don't know, 8-9 years working on mobile, and I was totally burned out by sort of mobile native engineering. And even before we decided to sort of start working on Linear, I took a few weekends to sort of dabble with web technologies, which I had sort of done 10 years prior, but a lot of stuff had happened in between, and I was totally unaware of sort of the technology stack of web when I started toying around. And I had done a few sort of synchronization engines before, and just thinking about the idea of like if you had an issue tracker, like what would you want it to be? And it always like I always wanted to build a application that was fully built on a synchronization stack. I tried it at Uber. When I joined Uber, I built a synchronization engine for them. I was a bit too late. Like the company was hyper growing. We did have sort of a Swift client and a Java client and a JavaScript client out, and a Go implementation for the server to do full synchronization on the Uber stack. But the company was just going so fast, and nobody else sort of shared the same vision. So I wasn't able to sort of push it through. To this day, I still think that Uber would have been much better off if they had adopted some sort of sync technology, because for the next 3 years they were sort of trying to do something similar with much worse results, and something that just took them a long time to do because it wasn't natively built into any of the mobile stacks. So I had this idea that the next project that I wanted to do, be it mobile or be it web, I wanted to do it on sync. So when I started toying around with this issue tracker in my back head, I just wanted to try out synchronization technologies on the web, and that was literally the first sort of prototype that I did. Like, how can I do sort of a very simple issue tracker that was real-time synchronized across multiple clients? And when we saw it with, it was Jory and I sort of hacking on these things, back in the day. And when we saw it working, it just felt, absolutely fantastic. And you could imagine, like, with synchronization, like you can be in an offline state, like where every single operation essentially happens on the client, and then sort of the transactions get sent out to the server, behind the scenes. And if you can build your application in a way where every operation is optimistic, where sort of the client can fathom that this operation will succeed on the back end, then you can be optimistic on the client as well. So when you do an operation on the client, you can already apply it on the local state and present the view as it will be a few seconds from now when the server accepts that change, because so few transactions actually get reverted on the back end. And with that in mind, like, we were able to build a sort of a quick prototype that just showed how quick your application can be. When you start building out things, like, everything is fast, right? Like, your first prototype will always be fast because you run it on your local computer. But we sort of knew that the speed wouldn't really drop from here. Like, the architecture itself lent itself to be real time always, right? Regardless of how much data you had or how big your application grew. And we just thought that that was the best user experience that you could build. And starting with the idea, like, once we started working on Linear, like, we knew that we just needed to build something better. So it was sort of an obvious choice to go with full synchronization, so that we could build an application that was just super fast.
Yeah. So just for clarity for people that are just don't have the context. So when you say syncing, this is a specific architecture pattern that Linear follows, where a large portion of your working set of data is actually synced locally, so that all the operations are happening locally. So when you're doing search, it's searching off of what's in your browser. It's not making remote calls every time you press a keystroke. And this applies to all the actions that you take. It's a very different architecture. I think I've seen it now called as like a local first architecture. I think it's different than I think people conflate this with like offline apps. I don't think Linear is really meant to be used like fully offline. I'm sure a lot of it will work, but it's not really for the use it when you don't have internet reason. It's more for if you can sync a large set of the data locally, everything can be really, really fast because there's no remote call. And it doesn't matter if your server is potentially slow or if you have a lot of different users on your server. Most operations are hitting it asynchronously. And that's kind of the idea behind the sync engine, I think you guys call it, right? And I've seen this pattern show up more, but it's still rarely deployed. I think there's very few applications I see that take this approach. And I think oftentimes when I describe this to people, they immediately think that can't work. Like there's no way that could work, or like sync the whole data set locally. What do you mean? That's like too much data. So like, do you have any thoughts on kind of like that initial reaction that people have?
Yeah, I mean, it totally depends on your application whether it can work or not. Like, local first or sync or whatever you want to call it, works for when you have a finite set of data that you can load to the client, almost fully. Like we started with a full synchronization. Like when the client booted for the first time, they would load the entire state of that workspace locally, and it worked for 2-3 years. And then we got sort of bigger customers where we couldn't load the entire data set anymore because it was 200, 300 megabytes of data. So we had to sort of implement something that still felt like you had all the data locally from sort of the engineer's perspective, but behind the scenes we would sort of stream data in if needed. But like, yeah, if you want to do, I don't know, like an application with a lot of data that sort of, changes all the time, then synchronization probably isn't the best use case for you. But if you have a finite set of data, like if you're working on what you normally or 20 years ago would have built as a sort of desktop application,
right,
that had sort of a remote backend where you would then store the data or synchronize the data to, then yes, synchronization can definitely work for you. The one thing that sort of we got surprised ourselves as well was like the benefit of it. Like we initially thought that, the user would get the benefit. The user would sort of, get an application that was super fast, and they did. But I think like the biggest benefit for us as a company was that we were just, extremely quick at, iterating on the product itself. Because suddenly, like you didn't have a web app anymore. Like you were not working on an application where you had to sort of, do remote procedure calls or, think about error handling on the back end, or sort of, sanitizing your data or whatever is involved in sending data to the back end and then, receiving it. But literally what you had once sync was implemented was sort of a local structure of data representing the state of your application. And that was all that you had to work with. You never had to go to the back end. You never had to literally do anything because, the sync engine would handle all of it for you. You didn't have to think about error cases because the sync engine, again, would handle most of these error cases for you automatically. So you were just like, you had a local set of data, you would manipulate that data, and eventually would call save on some of the objects that you actually wanted to commit to. And that was all you needed to do. So when you wanted to build any feature, you just essentially added to that data, showed it in your UI, and you were done. It makes it so much faster to build the product. And I think, it's one of the biggest reasons why we're so quick at, shipping new functionality at Linear.
Yeah, exactly. And that's been my experience as well. It's a little bit of setup initially to get everything set up correctly. And it's a little bit of a mental model shift because it's quite different from how most people build things. But once that's done, and we released a V1, like a beta of our new product. And that was a good amount of effort, a good amount of concentrated effort. This past week, we've just been adding new features on top of it. It's been insanely fast. Like I'd allocate like 2 days to do something. I would finish it in 2 hours. It's kind of like, it's not just a slight improvement. It's like a multiple improvement. It's really, really incredible. The other thing that you mentioned is a finite set of data. I think this is pretty interesting because I think when people hear that, they might think, oh, it's a very narrow use case that fits that, because obviously data is always growing, data is always changing. But you can be pretty creative about what that means, right? So with Linear, obviously your issues can grow forever for all of time, right? So you would think that's not finite, but practically there is like a working set of issues that you care about. There's maybe you expire out issues. I don't know exactly what Linear's logic is, but maybe you expire out issues that have been closed that are more than 30 days old. And it's unlikely that set of data is going to grow infinitely because the rate at which your team creates issues probably is staying the same. So I think a lot of applications actually can work under this model because you have natural ways of partitioning things, like B2B applications like Linear. You're not syncing all the customers' issues, just your own workspace's issues, right?
Right.
And even like B2C applications, like you said, Uber, it's not a social app. You're not like downloading everyone else's information. It's just your own information, your own trips. So that does cover like a good portion of use cases, right?
It does. And to give you an example of sort of the finite data set of Uber, Uber, when I joined, they were using what they called, hopefully it's no longer there, they called ping, which was a ping to the server every 3 seconds that would fetch all the data that the user could ever see. It included sort of user accounts and trips and past trips and future trips, everything. And they would sort of ping the server every 3 seconds with that. So they sort of almost were on sync, just a very sort of bad sync because they would, every single time sort of get the entire set of data. So yes, most applications, if you're not talking about sort of the social graph of sorts, do have a finite set of data. And even in Linear, where you're constrained to one workspace at a time, we still within that workspace are able to partition the data in a way where we're sort of can optimize what we load in the beginning and what not to load. So we do load everything that sort of has some sort of finite set, which is sort of your teams and your users and your not the issue like teams, users, organization, and labels and things that sort of we have under thousands of. Issues, we do see customers who have hundreds of thousands of issues. So we don't want to load them all because they're usually associated with a team. And if you have a large organization, like you will only be part of a few teams here and there. So it's not necessary for you to load up the issues of all teams in order to have them locally available. You can do that dynamically, like when you look into a team that you haven't looked in a while, we can load up the issues of that team at that point. Even if you go into sort of the issue itself, like we've got comments and issue history, which are only available and visible in just a few screens. So we're selective of not loading them at startup, just to get you to the first UI as quickly as possible, even if you're starting with a cold client. But when you then sort of navigate to a team, in the background, we start streaming in the data that we anticipate that you'll need in the future. And worst case, like if you look at an issue and we haven't loaded any of the data, you'll see a blank screen, a quick loading screen for like half a second, and then the data streams in because it gets prioritized of what we load up at that point in time. From a sort of engineering perspective, the easiest way to build an application would be that everything is local or actually in memory, because then you don't need to sort of work with asynchronous data. You would have just a struct of in-memory data, and you could just render your UI as you please. The moment when things can pop in, you need to work around it a bit and sort of account for that. You might not be able to show some UI elements, or some UI elements might pop in a few milliseconds later after your initial render because you need to hydrate them either from disk or go to the network. So it becomes a bit more problematic, but it's still quite easy to implement.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like 80% of your stuff fits on that first case, and it's kind of diminishes. Like there are some cases where you need to handle it specifically. So me and my wife also we work on another app together, and it's very similar. Like 95% of the day-to-day usage of the app fits into that very simple, everything is local, operations running locally model. But there are, some situations where they're looking at reporting and they're looking at they're asking larger questions of the app. And for there, we'll fall back to something more traditional. But to me, it's like progressive. Like you try to do it locally. If not, then you kind of progress to the more network powered things. And you'll find that, most day-to-day operations can exist locally. So one of the questions that I get a lot, and I actually see in the chat right now, is I think when people hear this model, they think like words like CRDTs or like kind of eventual consistency, but it's quite different, right? Syncing is very different than like collaborative conflict resolution type stuff. Do you have any thoughts on the differences there?
Yeah, sure. So we didn't use CRDTs for the longest time. Now we're actually implementing, finally CRDTs for our, description editor.
Yep.
Hopefully we'll have it live at some point, because that was literally the only point in the application where it didn't feel like being real time yet. But if you look at an issue, for example, like an issue can have a priority. And if you modify that priority, like there's nothing related to CRDTs that you can do there. Like somebody sets that priority, and the last one will win. Like if I set it to high and you set it to medium, what should it actually be? Like CRDTs can't resolve that for you and sort of set it to medium plus or something. So for the most of the properties on our model objects, like we just utilize the last one wins schema. We don't even show you any conflicts. Like if people flip it at the same time, like we don't show you that it was just changed as you made the change, because it's really not that necessary, and people very infrequently modify the same data, even if you're at a large company. But yeah, like the editor was the last piece that we always felt wasn't great, and we've postponed it for a pretty long time. Like it's been on our backlog for I think 3 years. And we always wanted to make a sort of fully collaborative editor that utilizes CRDT, so that multiple people can edit it at the same time, see all the changes coming in, and sort of have conflict resolution in the editor itself. But we just realized that it's not that many people that edit issue descriptions at the same time, so it wasn't really a priority for us. Now that we want to use the editor for a few other things, where we do anticipate that there will be multiple people joining into a session. We want to make that use case work very well as well, and just use CRDTs for text editing.
Yeah, it's funny. Right before you joined, someone asked a question. Hey, can you ask them why? I think that there's a linear docs feature. Why the editing there feels off? And I actually guessed it was exactly this. So I'm going to take the mantle that I know more about linear than anyone that hasn't worked there. So I've just looked at it so much. But yeah, so that kind of confirms that question, which is, again, it goes to that like 80-20 thing. Like 80% of your application is not collaborative real-time editing. It's just very simple data synchronizing. And there's a small portion that does need that, and you can kind of progressively look into that. I think the thing that people kind of conflate this stuff is when they hear this, they like think about, oh, is it like peer-to-peer? Is it like that type of situation? But it's not peer-to-peer. It like looks somewhat similar because you're synchronizing states. The difference between peer-to-peer and this is there's a very important peer, which is the server, which has ultimate authority on when something happened, what order it happened in, what's the last thing that happened. So when you have that in play, which is how most web apps work, most web apps aren't really peer-to-peer applications. You don't need the complexity of CRDTs for the majority of things. Like you have this authoritative state, authoritative server that can determine authoritative states. And it massively simplifies everything. So this isn't as complicated as people may have seen with kind of peer-to-peer technologies.
For sure. Yeah. And like, you could make Linear a peer-to-peer network as well, but, I don't know what the benefits would be. Even with our current model, like when we run, which was like the third thing that we got out of sync, interestingly enough, is, hugely smaller resource requirements on the back end. Like we're running this, with so few servers that, you could hardly imagine. Because most of the operations, again, happen on the client. Like there's no queries that the client sends to the backend. So it's only mutations essentially being, saved or being operated on the backend. And you do still want to sort of, do all kinds of validation and, have an API where people can sort of submit the same mutations as well. So, we need a backend for those operations.
Yeah, that's another thing that we've noticed as well. I think before performance work looked like trying to make my backend faster, trying to make my database faster, trying to like make all those response times faster. I haven't thought about that in so long. I have no idea how slow my backend is. It could be super slow for all I know, but you just cannot tell when you're using the application. So yeah, I always found this interesting where I think when people think about performance, they think about optimizing like very specific things. Like I'm going to optimize this code block. Or I'm going to, make my database faster, like these individual components. But performance oftentimes just comes from your architecture. Like what is the architecture you chose that can make certain things really easy, other things really hard. And yeah, it's quite fascinating because I think right now, if you look at, it's hard to say what is a correct source for this, but if I look at the conversations that a lot of web developers are having, it's all about optimizing server rendering speed and building these server rendered applications, or like, building new frameworks that are more performant. And I love to point to them that, Linear, which feels as a user, feels way more performant than majority of applications. And correct me if I'm wrong on this. It's just a React application, and it's just a traditional SPA, right? Nothing fancy going on there.
No, it's straight up. Well, sure. Like we have, optimized it and made sure that performance, on the client is good. So a lot of work goes in there.
Yeah, but it's like just the same technology that's been around for a while, just implemented in an architecture that allows it to be really fast. And yeah, that's why I've been excited to talk to you and kind of make people more aware of this, because there's just a gap. Have you seen more companies, now that you guys are out there doing it with this approach? Have you seen more companies take this approach? I'm telling you, like we're doing it, but have you seen it grow a little bit more?
I mean, not really. I would assume that startups that start are founded nowadays would have a look at synchronization, like if it's a good use case for them. I haven't personally sort of used. I don't want to say any apps that use synchronization, but most of the applications that I use probably don't. I wouldn't know if they do. I don't know. Hopefully it will just take time, for people to sort of start toying around with this. The problem is that when you're building something where you really don't have product market fit, it's insane to start with a synchronization engine. Like it's kind of wasteful and useless. Like to throw it all away, all that hard engineering. It's not it is hard engineering. Like it takes you time to build a good synchronization engine, and the off the shelf solutions. Might work for smaller companies, but at some point, like you'll have to build it yourself in order to optimize the use case for your users. So it's a big investment, and if you don't know, what your product is going to be, or whether it's gonna take off, then you probably don't want to make that investment. And once your product takes off, it might be too late to make that investment already.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why the business part ties in really well, right? You guys were entering a very established, clear market. You weren't trying to create a new market, very established market, and very clear that the entire edge that you're going to have is the execution. So it made sense to kind of invest up front. So speaking of off-the-shelf solutions, have you heard of Replicache?
I have, yeah.
So that's what we use for our products, and it was interesting because I had been researching Linear for a while. I was like, okay, how am I going to do this? And I was looking around, and I eventually stumbled upon it. And on their homepage, their demo is a Linear clone, and I was like, this is the best way to advertise because this is what everyone is looking for, or not everyone. Again, really small set of people that I think have discovered this or are interested in this, but I'm fairly excited about that, and I think this is what I love to see in technology, where it wasn't solution led. I found a product that I loved, and I loved it so much that I just had to know how it was built. And I imagine the Replicache founders also probably saw Linear at some point. You kind of see the approach proved out in a product for the end user. Then you kind of build a solution afterward that can make it more accessible to more people. I think a lot of times we see solutions kind of put forth and you're like, that looks cool, but I haven't actually show me a product built with it. Show me why it actually feels good to use, or what's a cool thing you can build with it. And this is a great example of it going in the direction that I think actually makes sense, right? So I'm pretty optimistic for Replicache. Again, like you said, I can already see in places where we're going to outgrow it in some ways, but just to make that initial, you have to build your own sync engine. It's still, and I want to make this clear for everyone listening, it's hard. Even when you're using an off-the-shelf solution, it's just very different from what you're used to, and it does take effort. But if your goal is to out-execute everyone else, it's just going to take effort, right? But it's definitely worth it, in my opinion. Cool.
Yeah, people should definitely look into it. And obviously there's other solutions as well, like Firebase being the oldest one of them all. Like that was actually, one of the initial sort of, proofs of concept that we did. My first implementation was on Couchbase. Couchbase.
Nice. Couchbase. The Couch and PouchDB and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, CouchDB. And then Firebase as well. And we sort of quickly realized that, they wouldn't work for us. Like I think CouchDB, just didn't have any access control. Back then, I don't know if they do now. And then Firebase, we did a small quick calculation on the costs, and our use case would have been cost us millions of dollars to access and load all of that data. So it wouldn't have worked for us. But it might work for you. Like if you're working on something small and you want to just add synchronization as an add-on to a portion of your application, like, yes, go ahead with, existing solutions and try to, start there and see how we can benefit from doing sync.
Okay, so people did ask, is it long polling? Like, what's the actual tech stack that you guys use for synchronization? So I think you've given a few talks and it's probably well documented, but if you can kind of just list it out here.
Yeah. There's I do have a few talks on how our sync engine works. But essentially what we have is a WebSocket connection for all the synchronization stuff, and then mutations still happen on a GraphQL connection or a GraphQL request essentially that we make, because we wanted to have the same backend for the public API and then our clients. We didn't want to duplicate it. So if you make a change on the client will create a transaction, send that over GraphQL to the backend, and the backend will create a sort of log of changes that happen to your workspace, and then send those changes back to the user over the WebSocket connection. So you'll be receiving all the changes that you've made and all the changes that everybody else has made through WebSockets.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting, because it's you guys do use GraphQL under the hood, so it's a marriage of the synchronization, but still relying on like the type safety and all other benefits you get from GraphQL. Yeah, because like you said, I think most companies will need, a lot of companies, especially if you're building for other companies, you're going to need an API. Just having something that makes sense internally and externally does make a lot of sense. Okay, cool. So I think that's really everything I had. Thank you so much for joining. This was really awesome. Like I said, I just want more people to know about how this stuff works under the hood and kind of be inspired to do the same. Again, thank you for joining, but also thank you for building Linear. Like I said, hugely influential on everything that I do today, which sounds like is what you guys hope set out to do. So hopefully it's a nice data point.
Yeah, that's so great to hear.
Yeah, so appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.